The announcement may have appeared sudden to the public, but inside the palace, nothing about it was sudden. For weeks, a quiet disagreement had allegedly been spreading through the royal household, and by the time Anne put her name on those papers, compromise may already have become impossible. Behind the controlled language and careful silence, senior members of the family had reportedly been wrestling with a question that went far beyond personal tension. This was not simply about who had offended whom, or which relative felt ignored. The argument touched something far more dangerous: royal status, official responsibility, access, inheritance expectations, and the line separating family privilege from service to the crown. Once that line became unclear, every decision carried consequences. A small exception made for one person could become an expectation for another. A private favor could become a public precedent. And suddenly, what looked like a family disagreement threatened to become an institutional problem. Charles reportedly wanted to avoid that outcome for as long as possible. His instinct was to find a softer path, one that preserved family unity without making the monarchy appear weak or uncertain. He understood better than most that official decisions could leave private scars. Once a relative felt pushed outside the royal structure, repairing that emotional damage could take years, if it could be repaired at all. William saw the danger differently. To him, uncertainty was becoming its own threat. Every delayed decision risked leaving behind a larger problem for the next reign. If rules could be bent whenever family emotions became difficult, then what would those rules mean when he eventually inherited the crown? Anne initially kept her distance. She had no interest in becoming part of another palace dispute simply because voices were growing louder. But the situation changed when it became clear that established royal boundaries themselves were being tested. Anne had always understood duty in brutally simple terms. Affection could remain private, but the institution could not survive if formal responsibilities were constantly rewritten around personal feelings. That belief placed her between two competing camps. Younger advisors reportedly argued that the monarchy needed flexibility, modern language, and room for changing family roles. Traditional figures warned that flexibility could become weakness if every exception created a new precedent. The announcement was rewritten again and again. Every sentence mattered. A phrase about duty could affect rank. A reference to service could alter expectations about privilege. Even silence on access or inheritance could be interpreted as permission. Charles felt the weight of every possibility. William feared the cost of waiting. And Anne slowly became the one figure both sides could trust to judge whether the final decision followed royal procedure rather than personal anger. That was why her eventual signature mattered so much. The documents were not simply giving someone permission to act. They were giving the decision legitimacy. And that distinction changed everything. Because Anne was not being asked merely to support her brother, she was being asked to place her reputation for duty behind a decision whose consequences could continue long after Charles himself was gone. Charles could make decisions as king, but this particular decision needed something authority alone could not provide: credibility inside the family. That was where Anne became indispensable. Her signature carried no crown, no throne, and no public spectacle, but within the royal household, it carried something almost as powerful. Anne's influence had been built over decades, not through attention, but through consistency. She represented an older royal understanding of duty, one shaped by Elizabeth II's belief that service came before comfort and responsibility before emotion. That made her unusually valuable now. Charles did not simply need support. He needed reassurance that whatever decision emerged would not be seen as the reaction of a wounded father, an angry brother, or a monarch exhausted by family conflict. Anne's involvement changed the weight of the entire process. She was not known for chasing palace drama or involving herself in every dispute. If she placed her name behind the documents, it would be harder for anyone inside the family to dismiss the move as revenge or personal politics. But Anne did not sign immediately. She reportedly studied the language carefully, line by line, refusing to treat the documents as a formality. And that hesitation exposed the first serious disagreement. Anne accepted that boundaries were necessary, but one provision troubled her. It went further than defining official limits. In her view, it risked turning an institutional decision into something deeply personal and unnecessarily final. Charles pushed back. He feared that leaving the door partly open would allow the same argument to return years later, perhaps during William's reign, when the consequences could be even harder to control. Anne understood that fear, but she also understood something else. Royal history was filled with decisions made under pressure that could never be undone. A rule created in anger could outlive the people who created it. A temporary crisis could become a permanent wound. William approached the issue with colder logic. Whatever arrangement survived this moment had to be clear enough that his future court would not inherit the same unresolved argument. He did not want ambiguity passed down with the crown. Catherine's influence was quieter, but important. She reportedly pushed for one distinction above all others. Limiting someone's official role was not the same as erasing their place in the family. Anne seized on that point. She insisted the wording separate institutional consequences from emotional belonging. Duties could change. Access could change. Expectations could be rewritten. But the documents should not pretend that a family relationship could simply be cancelled by administrative language. That demand forced another rewrite. Additional papers were prepared to explain what would change, what would remain untouched, and where authority would sit going forward. Only then did Anne sign, and in that moment she became more than a witness. She became an internal check on the decision itself. But the most dangerous question was still unanswered. If Anne had insisted on protecting the line between family and crown, who or what had brought the palace close enough to that line that formal documents were needed in the first place? Buried beneath the careful palace language was the real source of the confrontation, a royal privilege that had survived for generations, because nobody expected it to be challenged. Once a member of the wider family tried to test its limits, the palace faced a choice it could no longer postpone. At the heart of the dispute was a question the monarchy had avoided answering clearly for years. Where did family connection end, and where did official royal privilege begin? Being born into, or marrying into, the royal family carried history, identity, and recognition. But access to the machinery of the crown had always been something different. Certain residences, ceremonial roles, private archives, patronages, jewels, and forms of representation were not simply family possessions. They were tied to service. The request that triggered the crisis was reportedly small enough to seem harmless from the outside. That was exactly what made it dangerous. Approve it once, and another relative could point to the decision later. Then, another. Before long, one exception could quietly become a new rule. Charles understood the human cost of saying no. A harsh rejection could look personal, especially inside a family already marked by old wounds and public divisions. He feared that a technical decision might be received as emotional punishment. William feared the opposite. If the palace accepted the request simply to avoid conflict, the line between working royals and private family members could become almost meaningless. And with another generational change approaching, he did not want to inherit a system where titles and blood automatically opened doors that duty no longer did. The question of royal jewels made the problem even more sensitive. It was not necessarily about ownership, it was about access. Who could borrow a historic piece? Who could wear something linked to crown service? Who might one day expect to inherit an heirloom because of family connection, even if that person held no official role? One of the documents Anne eventually signed reportedly addressed that principle directly. Family sentiment could not automatically create institutional entitlement. Anne saw the issue through the old royal contract she had watched Elizabeth II live for decades. Privilege was never meant to exist alone. It came with service, pressure, discipline, and sacrifice. Remove those obligations, and the meaning of the privilege had to change as well. Yet Catherine saw another danger. Younger royals like George, Charlotte, Louis, Louise, or James should not grow up trapped by expectations they never chose simply because older generations had failed to draw clear boundaries. That was the contradiction at the center of everything. Clearer rules could offer freedom, but when written in official language, the same rules could feel like rejection. And the public would not hear all of this. The announcement would be polished, restrained, and carefully limited. Most of the dispute would remain hidden. That was why the wording mattered so much, because the public announcement would sound controlled and administrative, while behind each carefully chosen sentence sat a private consequence that one member of the family was about to feel immediately. The palace statement had been designed to avoid turning one relative into the story. But silence created a mystery of its own. If nobody was being publicly accused, why had Charles, William, Anne, and senior officials spent so much effort preparing protections against something happening again? That question became impossible to ignore because the announcement had been written with extraordinary care. No individual was named. No branch of the family was directly blamed. Even the wording around the original request had been softened until almost every personal detail disappeared. For Charles, that omission was the compromise he had been searching for from the beginning. He could establish a firm institutional rule without publicly humiliating the person whose actions had forced the palace to confront it. Anne supported that approach. She believed boundaries were necessary, but she did not want those boundaries turned into weapons. A royal rule should protect the institution, not become another excuse for relatives to punish one another through public embarrassment. If the palace could settle the principle without destroying someone's dignity, then in Anne's view, it had a duty to try. William was less certain. He understood the desire for restraint, but vague language carried its own danger. If nobody was named and nothing was fully explained, speculation would rush into the silence. Different sides could claim the announcement proved whatever they already believed. One person could call it victory. Another could call it surrender. And the palace might end up creating confusion while trying to avoid confrontation. Inside the family, however, there was no confusion. The relative at the center of the dispute reportedly understood immediately what the announcement meant. Their name might not appear in the statement, but the consequences were unmistakable. That was the cruel part of palace secrecy. The public could only guess. Insiders knew exactly where every sentence pointed. Charles struggled with that reality. Protecting someone's privacy did not protect them from feeling rejected. He could remove their name from the announcement, but he could not remove the meaning. Catherine reportedly insisted on one thing before the statement was released: the affected person had to be told privately. Nobody should discover a decision about their future through television, headlines, or social media. Anne agreed without hesitation. Beneath her reputation for discipline was a harder kind of compassion. Rules could be firm without being needlessly cruel. A direct message was therefore sent explaining what the documents changed and what they did not. The person remained part of the family. Their private relationships were not erased, but one assumption was gone forever. Blood alone could no longer guarantee official access, recognition, or privilege. Then, the real unease began. Another relative reportedly recognized that the same principle could someday be applied to them. And once the wider family understood that Anne's signature had helped establish a rule rather than settle a single argument, the atmosphere changed instantly, because everyone began asking the same uncomfortable question. Who would be next when that rule was tested again? For William, the documents carried a meaning far beyond the announcement Charles was preparing to make. They were a warning from the future. One day the signatures, decisions, and family arguments would reach his desk, and there would be no father above him to absorb the consequences. The crisis had started as a problem for Charles, but William could no longer pretend it belonged only to his father's reign. What Anne had signed was beginning to look like a rehearsal for decisions he would eventually have to make himself. Becoming king would mean inheriting ceremonies, constitutional duties, and centuries of tradition. But it would also mean inheriting something far more difficult: relationships already damaged by years of disappointment, rivalry, separation, and unresolved anger. William watched Anne closely. Her approach was firm, but not cold. She believed rules had to mean something, yet she had also refused to let those rules become an excuse for unnecessary humiliation. That balance fascinated him because it was different from Charles's instinct. Charles often tried to preserve family relationships for as long as possible, even when the delay made the final decision more painful. William feared repeating that pattern. He had already seen what happened when family fractures were allowed to deepen for years, and eventually, those wounds would not stop with his generation. They could reach George, leaving another future king to manage conflicts he had never created. Catherine understood that fear, but she kept pushing William toward another question. What did a palace decision feel like from the other side? A rule might look reasonable on paper and still leave emotional damage that could never be repaired. Once something became official, apologies might not be enough to reverse what had been broken. Anne put the dilemma more sharply. Compassion without structure eventually created confusion. Structure without compassion created resentment. A future monarch needed both. That warning reached directly into William's own family. George's path would naturally carry the greatest pressure, but Charlotte and Louis might face different choices. Would they serve the crown full-time? Would they build lives partly outside it? Could they remain deeply royal without being trapped by obligations they never freely chose? For William, the new framework suddenly offered protection. Clear expectations established early could prevent private choices from becoming political crises later. Yet one detail made him uneasy. Anne's documents were reportedly written to survive a change of reign. Charles could approve them now, but William might one day be responsible for enforcing them. That meant he was helping shape a policy he had not yet inherited the authority to control. And somewhere beneath that discomfort was an even darker thought. It was easy to defend a principle when the person affected stood at some emotional distance. One day, the same rule might have to be applied to someone William loved far more deeply. But before William could worry about how the rule might shape his reign, Charles still had to do something far more immediate: stand behind it publicly, and the final minutes before the announcement would reveal whether the king was truly prepared for what Anne had helped put into writing. By the final hour, the papers were signed. The language was approved, and senior households had reportedly been informed. Yet the announcement still did not go out. For a few tense minutes, everything appeared frozen, as though someone inside the palace was considering whether to stop it before it became permanent. The completed documents had already left Anne's hands and moved into the final administrative process. On paper, the difficult part should have been over. In reality, the most dangerous moment had just arrived. Charles reviewed the public statement again and stopped at one sentence that made the new boundary unmistakable. Once those words were released, there would be no pretending the palace had left the old arrangement untouched. Officials had prepared two versions. One was firm and direct. The other was softer, designed to reduce the sense of punishment. The existence of both revealed how divided the palace still was, even at the final stage. Anne refused to reopen the principle itself. In her view, they had already spent too long debating what needed to be done. But she did support changing any language that sounded deliberately humiliating. Firmness was necessary. Cruelty was not. William worried that too much softness would create the same problem all over again. If the statement became vague enough to comfort everyone, then nobody would know what had actually changed. Catherine pressed for a different balance. She wanted the wording to emphasize service, continuity, and fairness rather than exclusion. The message, she argued, should explain what the monarchy expected without making anyone feel publicly cast out. Then came one final complication. A private message reportedly arrived from the relative most affected by the decision. Whether it was an appeal, a warning, or simply an emotional reaction, it was enough to make Charles hesitate. For a brief moment, delay returned to the table. That hesitation carried all the contradictions Charles had spent years living with. He was not only king, he was also a father, a brother, and a relative who understood how easily official decisions could become permanent family wounds. Anne cut through the uncertainty with a simple truth: postponement was also a decision. Every extra day of confusion created new expectations and new chances for the same conflict to return. Charles finally agreed. But before authorizing release, he made sure the document still protected one distinction Anne had fought for from the beginning. Private family relationships would remain separate from official royal privileges. Then the statement went out. To the public, it appeared calm, restrained, almost administrative. Behind it had been weeks of disagreement, emotional pressure, and fear over what the monarchy might become next. And almost immediately, attention shifted to Anne. Why had she been there? Why had her signature mattered? The palace had finally spoken, but Anne's role created a second story beneath the official one, because if her signature had been needed to protect the principle behind Charles's decision, then the announcement was not an ending at all. It was a blueprint. The announcement would eventually disappear beneath newer headlines. Anne's signature would not. What she approved inside the palace created something more lasting than one day of royal drama. A standard that could return whenever blood, duty, inheritance, privilege, and personal loyalty collide again. That was the deeper meaning of Anne's role. She had not stepped into the crisis to punish anyone. She had stepped in to protect continuity. Her intervention forced the palace to stop treating the dispute as one relative's problem and define a principle that could survive beyond the personalities involved. That made the decision far more powerful and far more dangerous. Charles appeared to understand the cost. Monarchy often depended on clarity, but clarity could hurt. A rule that protected the institution could also create distance inside the family. Yet allowing uncertainty to grow could be even worse. Charles had spent much of his life seeing how unresolved tensions could return years later, larger and more painful than before. William saw something else. The framework Anne had helped shape could strengthen his future reign because the boundaries would already exist. But those same rules could one day force him to make decisions he would rather avoid. A principle only mattered if it survived the moment when applying it became personally painful. Catherine remained the emotional counterweight. She understood the need for structure, but she also understood the damage created when the monarchy treated hurt feelings as if they were simply the price of doing business. Clear boundaries could protect the crown without pretending that family wounds did not matter. For the younger generation, that distinction could become crucial. George, Charlotte, Louis, Louise, and James might have more freedom precisely because royal identity and royal employment were no longer automatically treated as the same thing. They could belong without assuming that belonging guaranteed an official role. The same logic reached into inheritance and royal treasures. Jewels, titles, ceremonial access, private records, and historic privileges carried enormous emotional weight. But emotion alone could no longer decide who received them, borrowed them, represented them, or expected them. For the relative at the center of the original dispute, that truth would leave a lasting wound. They still belonged to the family, but entitlement could no longer be assumed. Anne understood the personal cost of putting her name beneath that idea. Someone she knew might never look at her the same way again. Yet she signed because her entire royal life had been built around accepting consequences others preferred to delay. And William could not escape the darkest possibility. The next person testing this boundary might not be distant, quiet, or easy to contain. It could involve someone famous enough to split public opinion and close enough to him that enforcing the rule would feel like choosing between family and crown. Because Princess Anne may have helped Charles settle one royal crisis before the palace announcement, but the rule created behind those closed doors is waiting for a far more dangerous test. And when that moment comes, it will be William's signature the family is watching.